We're joined by James Meadway from here in London. He's the co-director of Verdant, which is an economic policy think tank. Welcome to the programme. So much to talk about, but just help us understand how severe are these attacks on LNG facilities in the Gulf for the region and also the global economy? And if somehow these attacks actually stopped, how long would the consequences last?
OK, well, this moves things quite significantly from what we've seen in the last, it's only 2 weeks or so now of the war starting the 28th of February. The Strait of Hormuz has been closed by Iran for some period of time. That has gummed up about 20% of the world's oil and gas supplies, along with about a third of its fertilizer. But at least in principle, that could be reopened relatively quickly with an agreement of some sort. What we're looking at now is the physical destruction of major parts of infrastructure, which had happened on a small scale up until this point, but this has shifted everything up a notch. We'll have to assess the damage. There's a technical expertise required to do that. But even if the war stops tomorrow, this is disruption now that will continue for several months after the attack and after the war being brought to a close. So this is very substantial. It moves anybody's expectations about the price of oil and gas and inflation more generally from thinking this might have been a bit of a blip, maybe a sudden surge, then prices back down again, into something much more significant.
And James, of course, we're an international channel. Let's see how this impacts our viewers. Starting here, you're in London, we're in London, the UK and Europe. And you wrote an article with a very incredible headline that says globalization is under threat from Iran war and Britain is uniquely vulnerable. Who else is vulnerable in this part of the world, Europe?
Well, in Europe, it's Britain that sticks out because we import so much of what we need for everyday essentials. 50% of the gas that we use for heating and electricity comes from the rest of the world. 40% of the food, 100% of the ammonia we use for fertilizer to grow food here. So it's a huge exposure to what happens in the rest of the world. Now, in the case of what's happening in the Middle East right now, most European gas is actually coming from European sources. But because it is traded across the whole of Eurasia. So in other words, there's a connection between what happens in Europe and what happens in Asia. And most of the gas coming out of the Middle East actually goes in the first instance over to Asia, to the east. It still has this knock-on effect down the line. So what you've seen as of this morning is a surge in European gas prices. So right across the continent, the price of gas on a day-to-day basis is up about 35%. Some governments have systems and price controls and regulations put in place to protect households and businesses, but these vary across different countries. In most cases, you're looking at potentially quite a big exposure of households and businesses to a sudden rise in the price of gas.
James, what about Asia? I'm seeing that India, Pakistan are being particularly hit hard.
Yeah, this is the other side of this, that when you have countries like Japan, for example, or take the Philippines and Thailand, where you're looking at 80–90% of the natural gas they get actually comes from Middle East sources, this is a much more immediate impact. And that's had pretty drastic implications for how these places function. In the Philippines, the government has been moving people towards working a 4-day week. So you don't work the 5 days, you work 4 as a way of trying to save on energy costs, a way of rationing the use of gas there. In Bangladesh, the government is trying to introduce a ration for the use of diesel, which is particularly difficult if you're a farmer. You need to run the diesel to run your irrigation to grow crops. So there's significant implications for economic activity that are very rapid across much of South and Southeast Asia in particular, and that will start to feed into potential for recession. And then, of course, a bit further along the line, demands, not unreasonably, for governments to step in and protect households and protect businesses from these costs, which is going to be difficult when you have, in some cases, countries that are already very heavily indebted.
And James, for so many people, of course, the pandemic and the financial crisis of 2008 are still very much strong memories, fresh in their memories. How close to 2008 could what we're seeing now become?
Well, the nearest available comparison is what happened in 2022 when Russia invaded Ukraine. And you had this very similar, in this case centered on Europe rather than the Middle East, but a similar disruption to gas markets, especially to oil markets, and then ripples out through the rest of the world and turns into a big surge in inflation. The complications here are first that in the first instance, as you said, it's kind of Asia that takes the brunt of the immediate hit, and then that spreads into Europe and then potentially starts to affect the rest of the world. The Australian government, for example, has been issuing some concerning warnings about the use of fuel and diesel and access to supplies over there. So that's the first order hit. The second one is something that was present in 2022, but is much more significant this time round, which is the damage to global stocks of fertilizer. When the Gulf is producing around about a third of the world's supplies of fertilizer, and it's growing season in the north, this starts to very directly affect farmers who need the fertilizer to grow the food. That means in a few months' time, there's less food. That means the price goes up. So you're looking at quite a sort of longer term impact on what's happening here. This is potentially much bigger than at least 2022 that we saw with the invasion. If there is a financial impact on it, and there is some talk of this in the US around private credit markets, potentially you get a kind of financial implications of the financial crisis as well.
James, thank you so much for speaking to us today. James Meadway, live from here in London, co-director of Verdant. Really appreciate your thoughts and time.